Hi and welcome to part 2 of my two-part tutorial for a ceramic pumpkin Tealight holder. In part 1 I modelled some clay stamps for 3D printing, and I modelled my plaster mould to plan the best way of creating a press mould of a pumpkin. In part 2 I will walk you through the process I used to create a plaster mould from a pumpkin, how to press mould the clay into the mould, and how I fired the clay in my garden at home to create pumpkin Tealight holders. I have included a list of tools and materials at the end of the SOLIDWORKS blog if you'd like to try and recreate this project for yourself. I would note that not all the materials are necessary to buy. You can use a variety of makeshift tools for ceramics. These are just tools that I have from my own ceramic practice. To begin, I'm using the cake tin, which has a removable base. I filled the inner seam of the cake tin with modelling clay to avoid any plaster from seeping out. Then I used a mixture of soft soap and water to grease the cake tin, which will make it easier to remove the plaster once it's set. I mixed 1.5 pounds of plaster to 1 pint of water and continuously mixed until the plaster began to thicken. I've also included the ratios for mixing plaster to water at the end of the SOLIDWORKS blog. I poured the plaster into the tin and tapped the tin gently onto the table to level out the plaster and ensure any air bubbles rose to the surface. Once the plaster had dried for around half an hour, I could flip the tin over and drop out the plaster. I did need to be very gentle at this stage not to damage the plaster, but it was also quite a tight fit. Plaster expands, so be aware of this when you mould with it. This creates my plaster bat. If you don't know anything about ceramics or plaster mould making, a plaster bat can be used for a range of things, but it's mainly used to draw water out of the base of clay pieces to help them dry more evenly, minimising the risks of cracks. I'll be using mine in a few different ways, including helping me to guide the pumpkin mould shape and size, and for rolling out my clay. Choosing a pumpkin, I went with a slightly smaller pumpkin, which is around 12 to 13 centimetres in diameter. I preferred the shape of this as well, but I needed to prepare the pumpkin for moulding into 2 parts. This included flattening the base of the pumpkin by trimming some of the pumpkin away like this. This will stop it tipping over. I can flatten the base further within the moulding process. I also needed to trim down the pumpkin's stalk. This is to avoid any undercuts in the mould. I also need to keep it simple to stop the pumpkin getting stuck into the mould. To start my mould, I used a ball of modelling clay in the centre of the plaster bat and sat my pumpkin upright and level, ensuring it feels secure enough for me to begin sketching a mould split line. The mould split line isn't perfectly straight because I need to ensure that I sketch over the widest area of the pumpkin to avoid undercuts. Unlike my SOLIDWORKS pumpkin model, a real pumpkin is more organic, so the seam line will reflect that. Now, taking the modelling clay, I need to build around the pumpkin, ensuring I don't move the pumpkin out of place or clay past the line. The clay will be used to create a barrier for the plaster. I use small clumps at a time, and I'm working up to the edge of the plaster bat. You are technically building a wall. It doesn't have to be neat to begin with, as I'll tidy it up once there's enough clay. Filling in all the sides, I use my metal kidney and scraper tools to scrape away any excess clay and smooth the clay out. I'm using the plaster bat as a guide, ensuring the clay is flush to the plaster all the way around. This is important because if there's any gaps, the plaster will make its way into those gaps and could pour out and ruin your mould. Now I can start smoothing the top of the clay and making it level with the mould split line. You want this to be as clean as possible, as any flaws will be reflected within the mould. Once this step is done, I'm going to add the notches as planned within my SOLIDWORKS model. An important step when moulding is to create a release barrier using soft soap to stop the plaster from sticking to the pumpkin or pouring down the clay and sticking to the plaster bat. So I ensure to cover my model with it and wipe away the excess with a sponge to avoid any bubbles causing holes to form in the mould. Using a thick acetate sheet, which is also used by cake makers, I'm wrapping it around my mould several times until it feels like a strong enough barrier for housing plaster. This needs to be nice and tight against the clay and the plaster bat. Then, using a mould elastic band, I secured the acetate into place, wrapping it around the plaster bat like this. I needed a little help for this, so my husband kindly jumped in. I also used some tape to secure the top part and some around the acetate. Once in place, I made sure there was no gaps within the clay barrier, and I filled any gaps with more modelling clay. This is again to avoid any plaster seeping out anyway. This here is a natch maker. I created this with leftover plaster in my bowl. Using a coin while the plaster is drying out but not fully hard, I twist the coin back and forth until a concave dome is created. It works by pressing the clay into the recess, scraping away the excess, and using the kidney tool, removing a clay natch to attach onto the clay like the ones seen in my SOLIDWORKS model. I cross-hatched the back of the natch and scraped the clay where it was attached to help join the clay. You don't want natches floating off into the plaster, so they need attaching well. I attached 3 natches before moving on to mixing my plaster. For this mould part, I needed 4 pounds of plaster for the top of the mould. A tip when knowing that your plaster is ready to pour is that there'll be no more bubbles floating up. The consistency needs to be a little thicker, like paint, and your hand will coat in plaster. Rather than the consistency looking milky, it needs to be a little thicker, like paint. Just don't let it go too far, as it will pour in lumpy and you may lose detail. When pouring, I pour down the side of the pumpkin so that the plaster pours more evenly and catches all the details. Then I cover the top of the pumpkin. Banging the table or tapping the mould gently will encourage bubbles to rise out of the plaster. Leaving the mould to set for an hour or more, I can come back and unmould. Removing the elastic band and acetate, I can clean up the top of the mould. This includes removing any clay and also neatening up the plaster with mould tools so that I have a nice smooth finish. While the mould was setting, I scraped the word top onto the mould part. This was to remind me of what way my mould needs to be. I scraped a chamfer to the edge of the mould, similar to my SOLIDWORKS model, and began peeling away the clay from the pumpkin, ensuring that the pumpkin remained within the mould. I scraped some clay over the base of the mould to try and flatten it further before moulding it. Then it's time to clean up the mould with a sponge, and then soft soak the mould and pumpkin. I repeat this several times to ensure enough soft soap is on the plaster. Without this, plaster will fuse together and you'll have a solid block of plaster. Ready to mould the base part, I bordered up the top mould with acetate, this time using clay around the bottom of the mould to stop the plaster seeping out or going under the mould. I added a rubber band and some tape again. I also used some clay around the edges to stop any plaster escaping. It can escape through the smallest gap, and when it starts it can flood out of your mould, so the prep is super important. I soft soaked the mould a final time and then mixed 4 pounds of plaster. Pouring in the other side, the mould is done. I left this to set for a few hours before returning to unmould it. Before unmoulding the pumpkin, I added the mould alignment mark seen in my SOLIDWORKS test model to help me line up the mould from the outside. I also added a chamfer to the edge of the base mould part too. This helps when lifting the mould from the table. When unmoulding the pumpkin, I need to be really gentle and patient. It's so satisfying once you get that pumpkin out. At this stage, my mould was left open for almost 2 weeks to dry out. You really need to have dry plaster to create moulded parts, as they work by drawing the water out of the clay. With my mould dry, I used some paper clay and rolled it out onto my plaster bat. Then before I pressed it in, I pressed some clay into the pumpkin stalk, ensuring I fill the space. Then I could press the rolled out clay inside the mould, pressing all the way around. This part does not have to be perfect, but you do need to know a few things if you've never worked in clay. You need to look out for air bubbles in the clay, so kneading the clay and popping out any air bubbles is important. The air expands and causes explosions in the clay during firing. You have to ensure that you push the clay into every nook of the mould, being careful not to thin out the clay. The excess clay is trimmed away, leaving a little lip above the mould for draining. I also wet the top of the edge to keep it from drying too fast, while I repeat the process for the other side of the mould. Extra clay can be added to thicken any areas that feel thin, but you want to try and keep the same thickness all the way around, as this can affect the drying and the firing of the clay, increasing the risk of cracking. Each mould side is hatched with a tool and sponged with some water to help join the parts. The mould parts are then pressed tightly together and left to set for around 1 hour. Returning, I can unmould my pumpkin cast carefully. The marks you see aren't cracks, it's just the type of clay I'm using is more rough and groggy, but I can smooth out these areas with some water or slip, which is clay mixed with some water. This can be used like potter's glue. Here I'm using my tools to clean up the seam lines of the moulded pumpkin, just scraping the clay back and buffing it out with a damp sponge. Finally, time to use the stamps. So the clay would be too tough to cut the shape straight through. So instead they can be used to press and print an outline onto the pumpkin like this. Then I can use a scalpel and gently cut the shape out to look like this. I can repeat this with the smaller star. Then before continuing with the stars, I used a circle cutter to outline where I want to cut out the back of the pumpkin to allow space to pop in a tea light. Removing this part, I can tidy up the pumpkin cuts and continue adding more cuts until it looks like this. Once all of my casts are finished and dry, I can start prepping them to be fired. You'll see on my blog firing materials list, I used a range of things you can find at home to wrap around or onto the pumpkins to create unique colours or firing results. Firing ceramics in a pit style firing can be very unpredictable, so it's okay to just experiment. My pieces were wrapped in newspaper or foil and were placed into a furnace bin and were surrounded by kindling, wood logs, straw, sawdust and newspaper balls. It was then lit with matches from several different points around the bin to try and encourage an even firing. Don't overload the firing. 2 to 3 pieces should be enough for a bin this size. You should also try and pad out the pieces as well, as they may fall onto each other and cause breakages. You want to keep the pieces quite low in the furnace too, to avoid them dropping and cracking. The fire should burn as evenly as possible and for as long as you can within the bin, so use plenty of logs where you can to keep the fire going. The lid of the furnace was put on as soon as the fire seemed consistent. Then it was left until it was fully cooled down before I could remove my final pieces. This lasted around 4 to 5 hours. If you remove the ceramics while they're still hot, this again could cause breakages to happen, as the clay would cool too quickly. I did have some breakages myself, which is to be expected with ceramics, so don't be disheartened. You should be able to tell if your pieces were fired hot enough, as they will make a clinking sound when you tap them. Here are my final pieces. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching.